First off, I want to thank the brave men and women who work behind the wall. I want to thank them on a national level because their job goes unrecognized.
How do they try to turn a guard?
Well, correctional officer. Sorry, I apologize. But correctional officer.
How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, great discussion. You ever get to that code, that medical code or that assault, and finally custody and medical have to work together? You know, and yet when we're trying to solve that issue, medical has a policy that says this, custody has a policy that says this, and neither one is making the effort to bridge that policy, bring those policies together. The reason why I want to have that discussion is because there's still videos coming up in the news where you still are seeing a bit of a conflict between medical and custody when we are trying to, one, safely and secure an inmate who may be in need of medical attention. So it's going to be a great dialogue. This is really something that we need to discuss, basically when the policies blend, how we need to work together. And guys, this is where the biggest liability is. So definitely worth your attention on this. If you want to keep your job, if you want to protect yourself, you know, your team, if you're a supervisor, this is definitely a discussion that's worth exploring. Now, of course, who am I going to have? The author and motivator. I'm going to add that now. I just figured I'll just put that in there. Author of The Cage Was Her Cocoon, Connie Alleyne. What's up, Connie?
Hi, everybody. Connie Alleyne here. I am the founder and president of the Civilian Corrections Academy. I'm also the podcast host of The Fly Behind the Wall and the author of The Cage Was Her Cocoon, as Anthony always makes sure I actually remember to say that, because I probably wouldn't say that. Anyways, you know, when we talked about this a little earlier, you know, it really sparked some thoughts about how we could mitigate the liability. And I think that it's important that even if the department doesn't necessarily put policies and procedures in place to make that happen, that we're thinking on our toes as, you know, individual leaders, as folks who are on the ground, on the front line, actually responding to these codes. So I think it's really important that we have this dialogue.
Yeah, and guys, like Connie said, we did have a discussion before because we have visited this topic before. So the question was, can we add some more to it? And I believe after today's discussion, there are some parts that we can evolve. So again, if we do have an older video, we have a lot of videos. If you just put medical and custody tier talk, you'll see that we've discussed this a few times. But having our discussion today, there are some parts of our discussion that we can add to and actually create a whole different perspective. So definitely it's time to revisit, because if I feel or Connie feels that we've learned something, we try to share it out as quick as possible, because guys, having information is what's going to save our careers. Now, guys, if you haven't, the show Tier Talk for you, brave men and women that work in corrections. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. We're going to go to our sponsor. We come back. Let's talk about the blending of policies when custody and medical have to work together. Stand by.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it. It's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
All right, and we're back. So I just want to mention that I know there's going to be a lot of times where you're going to have different departments that have to work together. And yes, there are going to be policies that are going to put those departments together. I get it. But when we're talking about extreme situations and that emergent need for two departments to work together, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be medical and custody. I'm not saying it's only medical and custody, but for the sake of argument, 9 times out of 10, when we're responding to that code, that assault or that suicide, it's going to be medical and custody that needs to work together. So before we begin this discussion, Connie, would you agree during those emergency situations, most of the time it's going to be medical and custody working together?
Absolutely. So, you know, there's a code somewhere called custody is usually going to be the first to see that there is some sort of situation happening. And then medical is going to respond to the respective area. And so, you know, the reality of us working together is always going to be just that. We are going to need to figure it out. I think one of the things that I think about immediately is I've seen great partnerships where we show up to the code and custody's already, started chest compressions. They've already started CPR, and even in those instances where they actually make sure the scene is safe before we can get in and start doing whatever we need to do from the medical position. So, definitely this is worthy.
Yeah, I believe there are going to be some codes where, let's say it's a fight. If there's nothing crazy, we'll be bringing the inmates to medical. But then there's certain cases like suicide attempts or a major assault or murder, God forbid, where medical is going to be in the wings waiting to get to that area. And hopefully custody can do what they can to get medical there as quick as possible, which means obviously their effort is to safely secure the inmates and then make sure medical and, the environment secure before medical can come in and tend. Now, mind you, that's key, guys. We have to always make sure the environment is secured before we can help whatever inmate we have to help, because we can't be able to help them if our mind is focused on other things. So the first thing I want to mention, and we're going to kind of talk this through, is when it comes to policies, and I want to first go to the highest level. So we're talking about executive staff, the people that make these policies. So when those policies are being made, we need to have discussions that talk about how those departmental policies affect other departments. And then we have to have people in those discussions that can talk about how those policies blend. Because eventually you can write whatever you want at top, but eventually it has to be implemented in a facility that's ready to operate, that's ready to move. So if you're only writing it in a myopic perspective and only caring about your department and not looking to see how certain things that you do in that policy could affect the other departments. So in this case here, I'm writing a policy on behalf of medical, and I'm only looking at what medical has to do. And I'm not in that policy at any point talking to any high-level custody official. Well, I'm not really writing a policy that is going to work, because again, part of that policy is the interaction with the other first responders that are going to come to the scene. So again, I guess we'll explore this first. Are we creating policies at the highest level that involve the interaction with the different departments? Or are we having those discussions before we start making a policy that's strictly departmental, as opposed to, hey, we got to start involving these other players because we need to create a policy that actually deals directly with how a facility would operate? So, Connie, what's your thoughts on the highest level policies being made?
So I could speak specifically to medical, for example, right? When we create a policy or procedure regarding any medical engagement, usually it is first the standard of care, right? What is the standard of care and the expectation from a care perspective that medical has to meet? And then in the midst of that, we begin to embed what are the interconnected spaces that we have to consider. So I actually sat on the policy and procedure committee for my organization for 5 years, right? And really what we tried to make sure was that there was always a custody person in that meeting, right? So if in fact we were creating some sort of policy or procedure that was contrary to a directive or to some sort of policy or post order or anything, we usually knew that, and we tried to mitigate the conflict before it became signed in as official policy. Now, I know that that probably doesn't happen everywhere, but that, in my mind, is the approach we have to take, because when we are in these emergent situations, the last thing that we need to be doing from a higher level perspective is creating areas where there's going to be chaos or there's going to be more gray area as to who should be doing what. And if we could clarify that up front, when in fact there is a situation, the only thing we need to do is sort of prepare for the staff to respond in their respective roles, understanding that chaos is not embedded in the policies, right? So I absolutely feel that when we are coming together and we're creating policies and procedures, yes, there are times where we do find conflict, but there's also times where I know for certain we try to make sure we mitigate that conflict so that in the midst of chaos, we don't have people stumbling over each other.
Now, Connie, you said the foundation of those policies are based on care, and what was it?
So usually it's based on the standard of care. Let's make sure we're meeting the standard of care so that from a legal perspective, if there are certain steps we're supposed to take, someone had a seizure, for example, here are the steps as a medical person you have to make sure you take when you arrive on the scene and you're stabilizing. Are you checking blood pressure? Are you checking airway? Here are things you need to do. And outside of those things you absolutely need to do, then comes into play all of the interconnected things. But I think one thing that, we don't speak to, or at least many policies are silent to, is what happens when you step on the scene, you do see that this event is unfolding. Does medical just jump in, right? Does medical take control of the scene and begin to give directives to everyone or not? And I think if that was actually written somewhere, there would be less situations where we are trying to figure out who should be in control of the scene.
I'm sorry, I got this bird that's grilling me from outside, just staring at me. I'm about ready to give him a standard of care. It's just staring at me. And it's like, who are you to stare at me on my property? So yes. So the foundation, you have the standard of care, right? So now custody's foundation is going to be safety and security, but also preservation of life. So therefore, you have two priorities: the standard of care, safety and security. I want to make sure that we get the public to realize that I did say for custody, safety and security, but also preservation of life. But there is safety and security. Like, you can't, when you're working in an environment that's chaotic, I can't tend to that individual unless the area is safe and secured. Now, obviously, the job you guys have in the middle of a chaos is you're going to run to save that life. That's your standard of care. That's in you. That's what we're meant to secure the scene so we can help you do that. But again, so you have the standard of care, but you also have safety and security from the custody side, but ultimately for the preservation of life. Now, I love what you said. When the dialogue's held at that higher level, some people may have to realize that you have two priorities going on right now. So you have two different departments that have a great priority that if we don't have a way to settle that or have a team that really knows each other, you may have a conflict. You may have a party that wants to rush in and do something, right? And then you have another party that says, hey, we're not ready for that. So yeah, I know.
I think the thing you raised that I think is really important is which is more important, right? Like, so, custody is going to say this is more important. Medical is going to say, loss of oxygen for more than X amount of minutes could lead to brain damage. It could lead to, you know what I'm saying? So like the priority as far as what would be most important in the moment, I get it. It's very hard to put that hard writing out there, right? To put it in a policy, to put it in a procedure in a way that, because it is judgment, right? Like you step on the scene, if someone has a weapon and they're wielding it at people, even though there may be someone on the floor injured who may be bleeding out, it's not safe for someone to go in there, for medical to run in there and just start doing their work because preservation of life is important, right? And so I think that's one of the things, or one of the reasons why we get to that point of conflict, because medical may see that, life is being lost, but it also just isn't safe. And so, in my mind, as much as, it may burn some of my medical people to say that, safety and security at that point is more important, because if you step in there and then you get hurt, you become part of the code, right? Like, you're not able to help the person that's down while the scene is still not safe. So, I was just thinking you raised that issue, which is really important, of there being conflicting priorities that are just as important. But if the scene is not safe, medical just can't go in and secure or preserve that life.
Yeah, the reason why I said that, because we did say at the very beginning that I can't do nothing unless the scene is secured. But we could see that if I'm only trained through departmental policy that preservation of life, like again, through medical policy is a priority, I'm not going to see the safety and security side because maybe the policy doesn't blend, or I'm being trained in an isolated fashion where, hey guys, we got to come to the scene. We got to do this. We got to do that. We got to do this. But there's no one from custody kind of interacting with that policy and letting people know, hey guys, whoa, before you do that, did we do this? Is this done? Is this secure? Just to kind of maybe put some level of generality in that policy that says, before you do something, even as a medical professional, are you making sure that the scene is safe and secured? Now, again, I would like to think that that's being done, but I sometimes I don't know, because here's another thing too, guys. When the scene gets secured, there's going to be a shift from safety and security to preservation of that life. So now I got my response team, let's just say for sake of an argument, I have the 5 officers on top of the inmate. So I already upped the level of force. At this point now, we're all about preservation of life. That shift is so quick, that I have seen some good work in medical, not have a good work in partnerships between medical and custody, where there is no need for communication. They just jump into the role. But then I see where, there may not be that good partnership. And then there's communication and just questioning and all this other stuff. But you got to realize something, because that shift is so quick, you got to get on that immediately. And again, it may not have to be, you don't have time to communicate. Sometimes you just have these two departments that work so well together that we know, because we've been training together, that, hey, safety and security is done. Let's get in there. Let's start, preserving that life. But Connie, would you agree that shift from safety and security, now mind you, that's still the foundation. I'm not saying we lose that, but at one point we're going to be focused on safety and security. I get it. But once we know that inmate's secured, how quick does it now shift to preservation of life?
It should shift immediately. But I think that's in an ideal world, right? But I feel that in the heat of the moment of the actual code, right? Like, we would like to think that cooler minds will always prevail. That's not always the case. I mean, you and I have reviewed at least 2 or 3 codes that cooler minds didn't prevail, right? That we didn't see when that split second, that hair of a moment where you could see preservation of life slipping away, that medical wasn't initially pushed into, like they weren't activated quick enough, right? And in a couple of incidents, we didn't even see medical in the midst of things to even be able to have that judgment call to be able to say, hey, listen, guys, step aside, let us get in here, right? So I think that shift has to happen, and there has to be a confidence that this is not about ego, that it's not about who's in charge, it's not about chain of command. It is, we have an incident here. And if the goal, our common goal, is preservation of life, then there's a point where custody has to step aside and let medical get in and do all the things that medical has to do. The one thing I can say is that in many of those instances where custody is already doing compressions, they're already doing CPR, I've seen great communication between custody and medical to know that, okay, custody is going to stop compressions, medical is getting in, right? Like, and like explicitly stating that officer so-and-so will stop compressions, nurse so-and-so is taking over. Like, and I feel like that's when it's really clear that this has escalated beyond what custody could do to stabilize this person, and medical is stepping in to take over. Now,
I'm sorry. I want to touch on something you just said too, because it's so important. I don't want to, guys, we're also, as we're discussing this, we're also discussing that we do have to know each other's responsibilities. We're talking about the blended, when you said custody stepping in, when we write these policies that are isolated, and basically I'm just worried about my department and they're just worried about theirs. I was thinking of a story where you may have limited medical staffing, right? And as soon as they come in, they start doing the compressions. And then custody is like, okay, well, they're here. Now I step back. I don't have to get involved no more. And then it's like, well, wait a second, guys. I only have one medical. Help that medical. We should have that, but we're now that medical, they've been doing it for 5 minutes, but, the court, no one's come yet to, identify the body or whatever it is, to declare the body being deceased. So we got to still keep on doing it until someone makes that call. So you can't have that one nurse going at it. So I've seen the great flow where you do have people that understand both roles. They understand that even though medical's there, custody needs to assist. The role doesn't stop. It continues to go. So I've seen an officer go behind the medical, tap them out. Let me get in. Let me help you. And they share. You know why that happens? In my opinion, is because they have policies that are written well that highlight each other's responsibility and doesn't literally say it stops here when medical arrives. Would you agree?
Exactly. But I think there's also too, when you have a great relationship with custody can see you're tired, right? Like your compressions are no longer effective, and custody will I've seen them say, hey, you want me to take over? Right. And like, I've seen rotations because it was taking long for the paramedics to show up or for the EMTs to show up, where you've got 4 or 5 different people doing chest compressions and using the bag valve and trying to make sure they do everything that they can in order to preserve that life until, the paramedics are on the scene and they either make the call or take that individual off to the hospital. So, you absolutely see when there is great communication and a great working relationship, because the focus is on the mission and not so much the focus on individual agendas.
Yeah, and I love when it's automatic, where there's not the need for communication. I mean, don't get me wrong. Yeah. Still, communication, I'm not minimizing that. I mean, communication's key. We know that. But I've seen just the flow where people just kind of know their role and they just kind of just get in. You don't have to tell them to get in. They get in. So again, my key here is that some departments may write policies in isolation, and to me may not realize how their policies do involve those other departments. And then finally, when a code happens, you can actually specifically see 2 different policies in play, where technically, from my perspective, I should see what looks like to be one, what reads to be one, but technically when you start seeing, there's medical doing their role and there's custody doing their role. And anytime that there's a need for the blend, that's where the confusion comes in. That's where the chaos comes in, because now they have to interact, but they don't know, who takes that. And it really is the priority, because you are going to have different supervisors for different reasons. And one supervisor may have to pull back and say, okay, now it's medical turn. Now they got to supervise and they got to do their position. So again, you start to see the concerns when you have the 2 different supervisors, what looks to be responsible for, I want to say 2 different things, but no, it's the same thing. It's just that you guys are treating it like 2 different things. So would you agree that if you have these policies from above that are kind of written in this manner where it's really departmental as opposed to the interaction or the operational need, then you can actually look at it and say, man, they are totally operating in conflict of each other.
For sure. So an example that you made me think of was like, and it seems so simple, right? So the code is called, who calls 911, right? Like, exactly. So you say custody, and there was an incident which we ended up having to put policy in place because medical was calling 911. Because when you call 911, you've got to be able to give certain details of the individual. And medical will usually have the health record who can give whatever information they have to give on the 911 call. Whereas there's times where, custody has now called the code, and we had a time where medical thought custody called 911, custody thought medical called 911. And like, that was one of those instances where someone has to call 911. It wasn't written anywhere who would be the person or the party responsible for activating 911. Is it in custody's policy that they activate 911 once a medical code is called? Or is it in medical's policy? Or is it not in anyone's policy because you guys are there and it's a judgment call? And I don't think it's a judgment call. I think it should be written. I think if medical has called the code wherever they are on the compound, that they should be responsible for calling 911 and giving all of the data that the paramedic may need in order to prepare once they get on the scene. If in fact custody has called 911 already and information has to be given to the paramedic or whomever, like medical should be there to meet the emergency medical, whoever is arriving, whether it's a paramedic or not, they should be there to meet them, to give them the information that they need so that they're prepared to start whatever interventions they need at the time that they get to the body, right? So it's kind of one of those things where we think it's common sense. We think, oh, well, custody is going to call because they activated the code. But is custody always the one to activate the code? And should there be a delay if custody didn't activate the code? If medical happened to activate the code, should we not call 911 because it's in a custody policy?
Right. So from practice that I'm familiar with, medical will recommend the 911 and then the shift commander will go ahead and make the call because they're right by the phone immediately. So this is usually the medical's on site, and then they go ahead and they call the custody, the shift commander, let's say, because they're by the phone and make the call. 911 is needed. But the recommendation for the 911 is usually done by the medical personnel on scene saying, yeah, we're going to need 911 for this. Now, it could be 911 that's needed decided on that scene, or they could take the inmate into like their infirmary, whatever it is, and decide, yo, it's getting worse. We need to go ahead and we can't do these things here. And again, you have some facilities that only have an infirmary, or maybe not even have an infirmary. I don't know.
Exactly.
911 would be recommended by medical, from my experience, and then that would make it to the shift commander who has the ability to make that phone call immediately. And then if there has to be some information, hold on, I think I lost you for a second.
Yeah, I only see your C1 right now.
Yeah, someone's trying to call in, so I have to hold off. I put do not disturb. Yes, it did. So what happens here is that I think at that point, can you hear me good or no?
Yep.
Custody at that point will have the information that they need to go ahead and at least get the call there, to get the call made and get the paramedic sent. Now, what I would like to also add here is that we do run drills. And me and Connie, I've mentioned this before. The drills should not be run in isolation. Remember, when you do a drill, the drill is meant to hopefully be successful. The drill should be as live as you can make it. You know, you want to give at least 80 to 85%. You want to make it as real as you can. But it's also to identify flaws. It is. You know, I mean, no drill is, I mean, if it's perfect, that's great. Don't get me wrong. But if there's flaws, let's address it immediately. Let's run it again. But you can't be running these drills without the other departments that are involved in it. So if you have custody running drills on suicides and assaults, but, you know, part of the response also is required for medical and they're not involved in it, or if you have medical running drills on suicides and assaults and custody is not involved in it, then you're going to wind up seeing that, you know, you're going to have drills the same thing. It's not doing anything. You know, in the heat of the moment, you haven't really solved what the biggest conflict is. Guys, the biggest conflict isn't really what we have to do departmentally. It's really always going to be what happens when we have to interact with that other department and priorities start to shift. And there's maybe more than one supervisor on scene. You know, that's where it starts to become chaotic. That's when you need to have those drills, you know, but with everybody working together. So would you agree that there should be some drills that, you know, if it requires interaction with other departments, then we got to find time to schedule with medical, or medical's got to find time to schedule with custody, because we all have a certain amount of drills that we have to get done, whatever, a month or a year, whatever the number is. And then they're meant to be drills that you should involve all the departments that are involved. So if you're not doing that, then these drills are really not doing what they're supposed to do, which is identify the flaws. Because again, if you don't have the two departments interacting, then you're not going to understand where the biggest concern is. So have you seen that? Do you see drills that are running in isolation?
Yeah, I mean, so our reality is that an assimilation that doesn't actually assimilate our environment is useless, right? Because we are now practicing in an environment that doesn't reflect what a true code would look like, right? So that means moving parts, that means unpredictability happening, right? So for example, like we'd run the code and the defibrillator wasn't working, right? Like, did we know where the other defibrillators were? That's what we wanted to find out, right? Like in an emergency response, do we have everything in the medical bag that we have? Does someone have the oxygen if we're going to need oxygen? Have we, because we've done them, because yes, you want to sharpen the skills of your team, right? You want your nursing skills to be sharp. You want everyone to know that the policies in their mind, right? This is the standard of care. This is what I should do. But we also want to make sure that this assimilation looks like what it would be if it was a real code. So while I think the skill building or skill sharpening assimilations are great, I think it's important that we actually have assimilations where, you know, you're running up on the scene, but there's an inmate in the hallway. We had times where, you know, someone threw water on the floor because there was a spill, right? Like, what do you do when there's a spill and then possibly, you know, something happens, right? Because we've got to be prepared to shorten our response time, regardless of all the moving parts. We've also had assimilations where custody was there with us, right? But those didn't happen a lot, because many times we have to juggle, right? Unless we have like a true operational shutdown for whatever reason, it's hard to pull custody offline to do an assimilation, or it may be hard to pull, you know, staff off the medical staff offline or mental health staff offline to join an assimilation. So I think there's an intentionality behind making these assimilations really reflect what a true code would look like. And that may mean, yes, we have to pull, you know, Captain so-and-so off the line. We need our medical clinic officer off the line because we need him to be a part of this simulation. So it's real. So there is that building of rapport and building of relationship and building of understanding of what each of us are doing in the midst of a code. We could read those policies to the sun, you know, to the cows come home. I think it's when we actually start working together that we actually see those codes actually they roll out in a way that's successful, right? Like, yes, we identify the gaps, right? Oh, well, you know, you didn't communicate this, or, you know, the bag didn't have whatever syringe in it, or, you know, custody wasn't sure where to position themselves at the time when medical was down. We had even done one where there were so many people who responded to the code that the captain or the lieutenant who was recording had to actually tell people to move out the way, right? In order to get the recording the way he's supposed to. And it's like, unless you do it, you don't know how to respond in these situations. So I think, you know, the simulations are critical to our success.
Yeah, you know, as I said, it helps with the automatic flow, but it also shows an active team, not two isolated departments. You know, I think that's the message we want to get out. Like when you start developing these policies where they have that interaction, you're allowing training that brings that interaction there on the scene, then you're going to construct a team. And yes, at that point, medical, I mean, at all times, but literally at that point, that emergency situation, medical and custody are a team. They're not, you know, two different entities. No, they're a team trying to do what they can to preserve life, if you will. But again, the major part of this dialogue, guys, is that when we are aware of parts of policies that we have to interact, we need to really interact. You know, especially during emergency situations, we need to have training that puts us together, that lets us see how those interactions play out. Because in the end, guys, when something happens, guys, we're going to have so much liability because each party is going to turn against the other. And I want to say something for the medical side, if I can, before we come to a close, is that if we don't have these drills that highlight our interactions and give us a chance during these drills to work with each other, custody working with medical, medical working with custody, medical's not going to know when they need to get involved. It becomes very confusing for them where safety and security starts to shift to preservation of life. It does, and then we have to be able to kind of go through those drills so they can see it and be automatic. I mean, don't get me wrong. Connie said communication is great. I get it. And it is. But I would love to see that automatic flow, because that preservation with that switch, it is so quick that, I would love to see someone already in play before the directive has to be given. Hey, you got to get involved now. You want to just see it happen. You want to see that magic flow. And then the cool thing is, guys, is that when we do work as a team and it blends so well that, you really could see that we are trying to work together, then we stand up for each other together. If something happens that, we did our best, but let's say that we lose the inmate or we lose this, that, whatever it is, we can honestly go up as a team and say we did what we could. We tried our best, but this was the end result, unfortunately. Hey, Connie, anything you'd like to say in closing?
I would just like to say, we talk all the time about working collaboratively, about partnering, and I get it. The relationship in some facilities is a little fractured between civilians and custody, but we don't have to accept that that's going to be the reality, right? Because we don't necessarily want either parties to be stuck behind some sort of liability when we could have avoided it. It's kind of, here it is, we work together. And yes, there are going to be times where our priorities conflict. But we all have the ability to learn, right? Like as custody, you can learn what medical or mental health or any civilian staff is doing. And as civilians, I think we have a responsibility to learn the custody side of things so that we understand what's going on in our environment. As much as you might want to go in and just focus on, I'm a nurse, I'm going to do what nurses do. Like, we don't have that luxury of pretending that or ignoring that we are in an environment that requires us to employ other skills that may not be our medical skills or our nursing skills or what have you. So I just think, with just respecting of each other and respecting that we have one mission, right? Even though we may have other things we're responsible for, our reality is that our mission is to keep this population safe, right? We share that mission as far as I know. And the more that we practice doing that and that it's not unfamiliar, the more effective we will be at doing that.
Yeah, and I like what you say. My closing thoughts would be, guys, if you understand the role of the people you interact with, you also understand your role. Let's be honest. Our roles are going to be dependent on those interactions. So if I don't understand what it is that you have to do, then I'm not going to understand how I fit into what you have to do. Both ways, custody to medical, medical to custody. So it's a good dialogue. Again, we're talking about the blending of responsibilities, where the biggest liability could be during those emergency situations. But in the end, guys, we have to start bringing that teamwork, and it starts from above. If you're writing isolated policies and when they trickle down, they still trickle without any effort to show how operationally we need to work together, then you yourself are the problem. You got to start working out those policies at top. It's truthful. You got to start, like Connie said, working out those policies at top that really do involve those interactions. So when you send a policy down, yes, there still have to be some operational, tweaks, but you're giving us a more detailed avenue to take. You're giving us policies that involve those interactions that were discussed at the high level, as opposed to expecting a lot of it to be done operationally when it gets to the facility. Work it out up top. Give us what you got, and then give us a little bit more. So when we get ready operationally, we can have that involvement already in play. And it will be great to see the policies are identical. It's great to see that, hey, we had a policy written about a code, let's say a suicide or whatever it was. And it looks like medical and custody finally have a policy where they both understand each other's roles. So they're both getting policies that show where each party needs to be at during these moments. And I think that is key. But again, it starts up top. As always, guys, the show is Tier Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit the bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.